After conquering Razorfon Crawl, OA and Vol found themselves back in Stormwind at level 30. That meant it was time for some training. But there was also something rather special waiting for them before they could set out for their next dungeon.
Hey there.
Oeas's first task was a visit to the bank, where he collected the materials needed to enchant his new axe. One extra point of damage might not sound like much, but surely it would make all the difference. With the axe properly enchanted, OA headed toward Cathedral Square, where both his own trainers and Vol's were waiting inside the cathedral.
Well met.
He first learned all the abilities available at his level, but saved one particularly special skill for last.
Go with honor, friend. Need help?
To put his newly learned ability to the test, OA headed straight outside the cathedral. Finally, a mount. OA immediately made his way over to Vol, eager to proudly show off his new mount. One problem still remained, however. Vol needed one of her own. Unfortunately, she had chosen a class without the privilege of simply learning a mount from her trainer. So the two set out for Elwyn Forest, heading far to the east in search of one. After OA handed over some of his hard-earned gold, Vol first learned the necessary riding skill and then purchased a mount of her own.
Open for business. See you later.
Now it was finally Vol's turn to enjoy the luxury of faster travel. Proudly mounting up, she joined OA on the road back to Stormwind, where their journey to the Scarlet Monastery was about to begin. With Vol's new mount safely placed on the action bar for quick access, the two of them set off on their journey. Razorfon Crawl had fallen. Another dungeon was crossed off the list. Their next destination lay far to the north, deep within Horde territory. So OA and Vol left Stormwind, crossed beneath the mountains to Ironforge, and quickly took to the skies once again. This time toward South Shore. The flight carried them far across the eastern kingdoms. Eventually, South Shore appeared below, one of the last convenient Alliance settlements on their journey north. Beyond it would become considerably less convenient. South Shore offered one final opportunity to enjoy friendly guards and civilization. OA and Vol appreciated it accordingly by immediately leaving. Their route first carried them through the Hillsbrad foothills. The roads were quiet, the wildlife manageable, and nothing nearby seemed dramatically more powerful than they were. It was, therefore, the safest part of the plan. The road led them through the hinterlands. At first, the detour still seemed harmless enough. But ahead waited a region intended for adventurers considerably more experienced than themselves. The comfortable part of the journey was now officially over. Then came the Western Plaguelands. OA and Vol were level 30. Most of the creatures living here had spent considerably more time leveling. The difference became apparent almost immediately. Traveling through the Plaguelands required a slightly different strategy. Roads were treated with suspicion. Enemies received generous amounts of personal space, and every movement in the distance suddenly deserved O's complete attention. Against all reasonable expectations, they made it through. The Plaguelands slowly disappeared behind them, and ahead waited Tyrusful Glades. A Horde starting zone had rarely looked so inviting. Tyrusful Glades presented a different kind of danger. The creatures were weaker. The Horde guards were not. For Owe and Vol, local civilization was therefore best appreciated from a considerable distance. They continued northeast, keeping away from horde settlements wherever possible. The roads were faster, the fields were safer. Owe and Vol had already taken enough questionable shortcuts for one journey. And eventually something appeared between the hills ahead. After crossing half a continent and surviving a region they had absolutely no business visiting, their destination was finally in sight. The Scarlet Monastery, a vast stronghold of the Scarlet Crusade, hidden in the northeastern reaches of Tyrusful Glades. Several wings waited inside. Owe and Vol would begin with the graveyard. Of course, the Scarlet Crusade had little interest in allowing visitors to simply walk through the front door. Owe and Vol responded with their usual diplomatic approach: consecration. Beyond the entrance waited the different sections of the monastery, but every journey needed a beginning, and theirs would start among the dead. Without further delay, Owe and Vol entered the Scarlet Monastery graveyard and began their next conquest. Shortly after stepping through the dungeon portal, Owe was already making his way toward the first enemy. A single enemy was hardly a problem for the two of them, especially since it was only a guard. Of course, some bosses had not proven much more dangerous than ordinary trash mobs either, but that was a different matter. After dealing with a few more guards, it was already time to pull the first boss and his accompanying group into battle. Naturally, a little preparation was in order. Owe took the opportunity to restore his mana completely, while Vol refreshed their buffs before the fight began. Or rather, she refreshed them just as Owe was already heading in to pull the boss. It did not take long for the first boss, Interrogator Vaishas, to decide that Vol was the more interesting target, and immediately turn his attention toward her. Owe quickly worked to reclaim aggro, which he managed after a brief struggle. No priests were seriously harmed during the filming of this particular encounter. What Vol enjoyed most was finally getting another chance to use her Masphere. Owe, however, was in no mood to chase enemies across the room, so larger groups were preferable. At least a few of them usually stayed behind. For this fight, the two decided to focus their attention on the boss, a strategy that worked rather well. The situation remained fairly relaxed, even if Interrogator Vaishas seems to have a very different opinion on the matter. Owe waited for the feared enemies to make their way back to him, and by then there was not much health left to take from the boss. Accordingly, it did not take much longer for the last of the boss's defenses to crumble, leaving an Interrogator Vaishas defeated by our two adventurers. Vol could hardly wait to see what the boss had dropped. Spoiler, it was nothing particularly exciting. Neither of them had much use for a fist weapon. There was still one small matter left. However, the enemy they had largely ignored during the fight was still very much alive. They made relatively short work of the remaining enemy, and with that, it was time to move on. Owe and Vol simply slipped past the next group of enemies, with Mind Soothed doing most of the work to make that possible. Owe's lack of subtlety, however, ensured that the next group could not be avoided quite so easily. This one would have to be dealt with properly. Vol had discovered another useful ability: mind control. Against the Scarlet Scryers, it was particularly convenient, since they had the rather unpleasant habit of putting her to sleep for 30 seconds at a time. It did not take long for Vol to experience that ability firsthand. Shortly after releasing the Scryer from mind control so they could finish her off properly, Vol was promptly sent to sleep. Owe was left to handle the situation on his own. Fortunately, with only one enemy remaining, this was hardly a crisis. He tried unsuccessfully to wake Vol, but the spell soon wore off by itself, allowing her to rejoin the fight. The last enemy before the courtyard was quickly defeated. Vol then encouraged OA to pull a few larger groups, something he was more than happy to do. What neither of them realized was that this particular decision was about to become a problem rather quickly. The ghosts themselves were not the problem. The real trouble came from a zombie OA picked up while making half a lap around the dried-up fountain, because this particular creature had one rather unpleasant ability. The ability cast on OA massively reduced the healing he received, leaving Vol with almost no chance of keeping him alive. He was defeated shortly afterwards, and Vol became the next target. She tried to make her escape, but with the enemies already on her heels, she did not last much longer either. They wasted no time making their way back into the dungeon. This time, they dealt with the enemies a little more carefully, and soon found themselves at the entrance to Honor's tomb. OA decided to try one of his more specialized spells, since paladins had a few useful tricks when dealing with the undead. Much like Volsphere, his spell sent the target fleeing uncontrollably out of the crypt. And moments later, the two found themselves fighting two zombies instead of one. By now, OA and Vol had gathered plenty of experience with enemy numbers increasing unexpectedly during a fight. They made relatively short work of the two zombies and could finally turn their attention back to the newly discovered crypt. Their next target was a huge group of unfettered spirits. Realizing that none of them were elite, OA and Vol decided there was little reason not to pull the entire group at once. Once surrounded by ghosts, however, their strategy became slightly more sensible. Focus down one target at a time and steadily thin out the crowd. Consecration and Retribution aura naturally helped a great deal, steadily draining the health of the other spirits at the same time. Someone had also told O about a way to modify his shield so that attacking enemies would take even more damage. That sounded extremely useful for dealing with larger groups, and certainly like something he would have to look into. But until then, no spikes, still plenty of area of effect damage. After a short while, the final spirit fell as well, leaving the group free to be looted. Now only one enemy stood between OA and Vol and another completed dungeon. Bloodmage Thalnus. For now, it was time to sit down for a little bit and regain some mana and health points. After a short round of preparation, it was time. OA moved in to engage Bloodmage Thalnus, the final boss of this relatively short dungeon. One thing quickly became clear: things were about to get rather hot. The damage was still fairly manageable, but OA and Vol knew better than to completely underestimate a skeletal mage. Thalnus was believed to have once been a blood elf mage before. Undeath reduced him to the rather less healthy-looking figure now standing before them. Considering that he had apparently continued practicing magic, even after losing most of the usual requirements for being alive. Treating him with at least a little caution seemed reasonable. How do you stop a spellcaster from casting? By removing the mana required to do it. Vol was more than happy to make generous use of mana burn. Once Thalnos had been completely drained of mana, there was suddenly very little left in his arsenal to worry about. Without his spells, the fearsome Bloodmage had become considerably less impressive. After defeating Thalnos, it was once again time for Vove, the ever-reliable loot magnet, to demonstrate her peculiar talent. She reached into the remains and emerged with a rather beautiful pair of shoulders. A proper feast of loot by their standards. Vole happily claimed the newly dropped shoulders and wasted no time putting them on. Another adventure was complete, and another dungeon could be crossed off the list. If you enjoyed the episode, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments which dungeon OA and Vo should tackle next. There are still plenty of adventures waiting for them, so make sure you do not miss the next one.